We continue now with the fourth part of our study from Exodus chapter 7, verse 14 to 9, verse 12. And as we get into the material for this day, we come into some of what is really the harshest kind of warfare that we have anywhere in the Bible. God is going into battle against an entire people, and this people has been seen to be strong-arming the children of Israel, and so now God says, I will step in and I will act. We really need to pause a little bit and simply ask ourselves the question about what is going on with the punishment and the anger and the wrath of God. Humanly speaking, no one understands that they are under the authority of God. Humanly speaking, when we are born, we think of ourselves as our own gods and look to ourselves as the highest good and the most important power in our lives. And thus, rather than simply shaking our heads and saying what a terrible group of people this was that Israel had to deal with, or that God had to deal with, it's time to reflect on the fact that our old sinful nature makes us no different from Pharaoh. There are three different words, as I've mentioned before, for what happens in Pharaoh's heart. One word is that it becomes heavy. The word for the liver, the heaviest part of the internal organs, is used. Also, the same word is connected with the word for glory, something that's got a lot of weight to it, but here that his heart is weighed down with heaviness. Another term, that he stiffened, like he stiffened his neck up and said, no, I'm not going to do it. And the third one is sort of a word for hold, or to grip tightly, as if someone wants to take something away from you and you're holding on to it. So even the various terminology comes out in different ways. And this is really a very interesting analysis of what human nature is. The Pharaoh is simply, par excellence, the one who says, I don't want anyone else being in charge. Before the fall into sin, Adam and Eve would have recognized that God was in charge and that was very good for them. But everything comes upside down in the fall, and so what was natural is now unnatural, and what was unnatural is now natural. I'll do what I want. One of the real issues here is that God says, I will allow no one to finally do things against my will. And we ought to recognize that what is different about us as children of God is that God has changed our heart. He has softened our heart. The book of Ezekiel, in a couple of different places, says God installs a new heart, not a heart of stone, but a heart of flesh. The prophet Jeremiah says that God would write his will and his instructions on the heart. So there is much here about the heart as the depth of the human being, something that Pharaoh would not have been used to, that anyone would come up to him and say that he couldn't do everything that he set his mind to. He was, in essence, God, the highest power in the land. Every human being is born thinking the same thing. And there are some who get into positions of power and they would try to use that even though they realize it fails finally. And those who are not in power are really no better because they wish they were. So it's not as if anyone escapes from the desire to make life turn out in a particular way. What God is going to do here is he is going to show that human beings are not in charge, and that finally there are things that are under God's control, thinking back to Genesis 1, that God is the creator of all things and can change things at will. You might also notice, in looking at these plagues, or signs as they're sometimes called, that they are not all with the exact same pattern. There are times when Moses acts. There are times when Aaron acts. There are times when a plague takes place without any particular action. There are times when Pharaoh is confronted. There are times when Pharaoh is simply told what is going to happen. And there are times when a reaction of Pharaoh is given to us. So to look very carefully at these, we see that there are very different kinds of things going on. Some of the earlier plagues are against or involving the creation, starting with the water and some of the animals that are pests and plagues, and then affecting the animals, and then coming to affect the human beings. Some have said that these would all have been natural disasters, but it's pointed out that you're not going to have water change to blood in a bowl. And the fact that the quickness of how these, for example, the frogs die or the gnats disappear, is another issue. Some of these plagues just kind of go away on their own. For some of them, there is a direct request that they be removed. In other cases, after Pharaoh has asked for them to be removed, he hardens his heart, or it says it didn't faze him, or one of them that we see this evening even says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So there's a real complexity about everything that is going on here. The first plague, water turning to blood, is a plague that Moses carries out by touching the water with the staff that has turned into, or had turned into, a serpent. We're not told about how this one is reversed. And it seems that just after time, then the fresh water returns again and the people have their drinking water. It's something that the magicians can do as well. Never says exactly how, if all the water that Moses saw in the land turned blood, where the magicians got their water from, and so some of these things are just kind of left as loose ends. The point is that this is kind of a reversal of the creation. It's in some ways like what happens in the flood, where the waters that had been pushed down below the ground and the waters that were up above the firmament all kind of squished together once again. So here also, God says, I am keeping all of this so that it is working well, and if I pull back my support, then things can turn very nasty very quick. We all take, we assume and take for granted that certain things are going to be around us, like oxygen and butterflies and warm and cold weather and the sun and the moon and the stars. We're told when the end of the world comes that the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood, and what it really, I think, gets at is that God's holding all this together, and we at our own peril think somehow that we are in charge. So one of the lessons to be taught is that just like when we have a windstorm and we lose power, so in the presence of God, it is His action which keeps us supported. And the fact that things go well so much of the time, that God causes His rain to fall on the evil and on the good, that He sends the sunshine on people, even of countries where wickedness is the rule of law, even on people whose hearts are set to do everything just the opposite of the way God would want things done. So that first plague kind of disappears. The second one, with the frogs, is a little bit different, because now it is not Moses who does it, but Aaron. And once again, just to make matters worse, the magicians are able to make frogs as well. We don't know that Pharaoh would have been very pleased about that, but at least in these beginning miracles or signs, it says that the magic arts of others were able to pull that off as well. It's not going to be long before the magicians aren't able to do that anymore. But the result of this is that he hardens his heart. He simply says, I don't think that's important enough. I'm not going to let you go. He'll gradually warm up a little bit to say, go worship or sacrifice in my country, and then go a short distance, and then go a short distance, but don't take your children. So he begins to probably not mellow, but see if he can barter to let some little thing happen. The frogs then are all caused to die, and as happens quite often, they're piled up and then there's a great stink. You're going to see that later with the story of the Israelites as the quail are brought in when the wind blows the quail in, and the Israelites have been complaining about having no food, and there's once again a stink. God says, if I want to, I can give you plenty. And a little bit of an indication here that very often we would think that God is holding out on us and could give us more, and He says there might be some disadvantages in having as much as you want. The third plague is the plague of the gnats. Some translate this the plague of the mosquitoes, because gnats or mosquitoes are there. It's probably not correct, according to some translators, to translate this as lice, because that's not a native element in Egypt, though of course, even if it's not native, it could be brought there as well. Here, God tells Moses to tell Aaron, and Aaron is the one who uses his staff then. And this is the first one where the magicians are not able to do the same thing. There's nothing here about how it is stopped. We're not told much about any conversation with Pharaoh at this point. They don't meet up with Pharaoh, it just seems to kind of be a lot less developed. We'll notice also that not all the plagues are described in the same amount of detail. The fourth plague is the plague of the flies, and this is one that happens in front of the Pharaoh, and he is here for the first time confronted with the fact that not every plague that happens to the Egyptians will happen to the Israelites. That is another distinction now as things get more and more complicated. God says, I'm going to distinguish between those who are of my people and those who are of your people. The comment at this point from the Pharaoh was, just sacrifice to your God right here. Go ahead and just offer your offerings where you are. And Moses responds and says, no, the people of your country will harm us if we do that, because they don't believe in sacrificing, and they will hurt us if we do. There's been a little bit of an undercurrent of the fact that the Egyptians are much more people who are people of farming and of raising crops, which they're going to ship north along the Nile and then sell to other people, whereas the Israelites are people of the husbandry, animal husbandry, and why all of this is taking place and why this business with we want to go sacrifice and we want to sacrifice to our God and we have to go to another place and 3 days journey, none of that is really made very clear. At this point then there is a desire that the flies will be taken away, and so that finally takes place. But here there is no involvement specifically of Moses, if memory serves me right, in this one. The fifth one is the plague of the livestock. Now we're getting on to not just pests that come in from the outside, but things that directly affect the livelihood of the people who are there directly. You're going to have animals that are getting sick now. Once again, it is only the people of Egypt who suffer the problem with their animals. The livestock of Israel is going to be spared, and of course they are going to take that along when they go into the land of Canaan and leave the land of Egypt. The sixth plague, a little bit of humor is brought in when we look at the plague of the boils, because now the reason why the magicians can't help with the process of trying to do the same thing to others is they are sick. The first two they were able to do something, the third one they couldn't. Now they're so sick they can't even leave their houses, and they have told the Pharaoh there is something mighty going on here, but that just kind of hardens his heart and makes him more stiffened, or makes him hold on more strongly, or makes him more stubborn about going on with the path that he has been on. At this one, with the sixth plague, it is Moses who gathers some of the soot from their kilns and throws that up in the air, and it says that all the people then who have that fall on them are going to get sick because of it. Another uniqueness with this plague is that the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart. It's one thing to say that God is doing something that causes him to be stiff or harder in his resolve. It's another thing when the text now says God's actually doing it on the heart of Pharaoh. And so there are all sorts of little differences that come up. There is no specific conflict or discussion of the conflict with the Pharaoh in this one. There doesn't seem to be any point at which the boils are taken away. That story is kind of left hanging as well. So we have some cases where the Pharaoh pleads for mercy. There are some cases where he doesn't. There are some cases where the plague is actually physically removed, and other cases where we're not told about how that happens. There are cases where Moses acts, where Aaron acts, when they're in front of Pharaoh or apart from him. And this rather very complex series of events, many say would be taking place over about a year's time period. Obviously, not every animal is going to be destroyed if there are some of them yet for later plagues. And so we might also reckon with some hyperbole where it sort of says everything was affected. And when we today have something like we say trees were knocked down all over, and then you go for a walk or drive in your neighborhood and you see that not every tree is absolutely down unless it's really been a very, very bad storm. We can reckon with the fact that hyperbole would be involved here as well, but that it was a massive nature of the way that this was happening to the people of Egypt. They don't probably have any better indication of exactly why the things are going on. Most of the people would not have been watching the 6 o'clock news to find out this confrontation with this old man who's come from the desert, and they would have simply suffered in silence and maybe never even known about the confrontation that's going on. To reflect a little bit more then, we recognize here something of what is called holy war, or God's war. It's really part of the covenant promise to Abraham. Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. I will bring problems on those who try to bring problems on you. This is not just a random action of God, though we have to admit, like with the flood, innocent animals die, and as with the flood, there are human beings, now not the whole world's worth of human beings except Noah and his family, but there are human beings who suffer because of the stubbornness of a few leaders. One would assume that there would have been other Egyptians who would have sided with the Pharaoh against what's being said here, and that there would have probably been Israelites who would have said, our life is okay, yeah, we have to suffer, but we're able to survive here, and would not have favored Moses, especially after all of the troubles that had been caused for them early on. So we have a time when God is dealing with human beings and saying, if humans can't stop this activity, then I will. It's not really a very uplifting section of the scriptures, but it does say that God is almighty, and that in his almighty nature he acts to love human beings by stopping the wickedness of those who would try to harm them. There are people throughout the ages who have wondered, why hasn't God stopped people sooner? People who have pleaded, as some of the Psalms do, for God to act and bring plagues upon those who have been wicked. And we know that hundreds and hundreds of people die from their faith every week around this world because they believe Christ is Lord, because they believe that God is active, and because they run into the likes of the pharaohs. The only hope we can hold out is that in eternity God says nothing, whether it's pestilence or famine or nakedness or sword, all of what's in Romans 8, nothing will separate us from the love of God in Christ. And to remember also that the temptation can come for us to seek to be our own God, and it is always a call for repentance, to ask God to cure our hearts and to help us recognize when we might be going away from him, and to change that heart so that our heart is softened and not hardened or stiffened. God's continued blessings to you as you continue your study of the book of Exodus and look at the mighty ways in which God has acted in the past. And I hope that you will be able to see that there are ways, especially resurrection, but other ways also in which he works in our daily lives as well. God's blessings to you.